Good morning. This is Dr. John Hulsman reporting in from Biden's trip to Summit Land. The past week, Joe Biden has found himself in 3 different European areas: Cornwall for the G7 meeting, Brussels for the NATO meeting, and Geneva for the meeting with Vladimir Putin. What did we learn from Biden's trip and all the summitteering that is going on? We learned a lot, and that very little happened. It reminds me a little bit of Sherlock Holmes' classic story, where he made his key deduction on the dog that did not bark in the night. None of these summits amounted to much more than good housekeeping, and that really calls into question Biden's theory of the case. The basic view for Joe Biden is that the world is now bipolar. There are 2 superpowers vying for ultimate dominance, the U.S. and China. Beneath them, there are 5 great powers: the Anglosphere countries, the EU, Japan, India, and Russia, that are beneath them. And Biden rightly criticizes President Trump for not cultivating these great powers just beneath the United States in terms of power, which matters so much, because most of these countries skew toward the United States, meaning the EU, the Anglosphere countries, India, and Japan are all more pro-American than pro-Chinese, with only the Russians tilting more toward Beijing. So to take advantage of these great powers and cultivate this alliance structure goes a long way toward who will dominate the new era. And Biden says that ought to be the United States, given these proclivities. All this makes perfect sense, but then he goes further. And as Albert Einstein said about thinking, simplify as much as you can, but never make things too simple. And Biden has gone from an elegant theory to oversimplification, I would argue, because the summit meetings of the last week have proven that his theory of the case is overly simplistic. Biden has gone on to say, with the fawning commentariat of both the NGO community and the media, that there's a doctrine behind this. The democracies all tend to side with one another, that the U.S. will emerge as the champion of democracy, China is the champion of autocracy, and this ideological clash will really define the new era that we live in. The problem with this theory is that, again, it just doesn't stack up to the real-world summitteering of the last week, and proves Einstein's dangerous dictum correct. What happened to the G7 meeting? There was some good housekeeping. For one thing, Biden championed the Build Back Better Now program as a geoeconomic response to China's Belt and Road Initiative, gathering together all Western aid development program for infrastructure in the developing world, geoeconomically proving there's an alternative to becoming under China's geoeconomic thumb. All this is good, but the proof is in the pudding, and the pudding is there's no new money here. This is just bundling together old money, hopefully in a better, more efficient way, but there's nothing new under the sun here. The second point is Italy, which is positive, that Mario Draghi, the traditional Atlanticist, Europeanist, has moved Italy back from a more neutralist position where a former 5-star dominated government signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, being the only G7 member to do so. And Draghi has said, well, if this Build Back Better Now world program amounts to anything, we may reconsider the Belt and Road Initiative. And more broadly, this is Draghi bring Italy back into the G7 fold, and this is good news indeed. And then lastly, probably the most substantive thing to happen at the summit was the finance ministers ahead of the meeting agreeing to a floor for corporate taxation of about 15% to deal with big tech's rather shameful evasion of taxes. All this is nice, but none of this amounts to a headline. Basically, beneath this, problems became clear. For one thing, China, which had been the only topic, Banquo's ghost here, mentioned in foreign policy over a day, the only topic that mattered. And what is the outcome here? It's not even mentioned in the final communique. And as a summiteer and a DC veteran, let me tell you that when you don't mention something in a communique, it means that there was no agreement about it. Indeed, we know that from an earlier draft, China had been attacked for its labor practices, human rights violations, and forced labor in western Xinjiang province against the Uyghurs. The Europeans, who see China as much of a market as a threat, water this down to say that globally we need to worry about forced labor. This means nothing. Frankly, I don't know anyone who's in favor or would admit to being in favor of forced labor. The Europeans watered this down because they're not with the rest of the G7 over China. This is clear. The Anglosphere countries at the G7 meeting, the UK and Canada, sided with the United States, as are India and Japan over and over again, in a very strong anti-Chinese coalition. The Europeans are vacillating between a neutralism and a pro-American stance, somewhere on this continuum. So if Biden going into these meetings with his grand doctrine of autocracy versus democracy sees three basic goals: win over the European allies, prioritize China as the danger, and park Russia. On this first point, win over the European allies, the jury is still very much out. As to the second meeting, it's just more of the same. At the NATO meeting, yes, China was mentioned for the first time in the NATO communique 10 plus times, but never specifically mentioned as an adversary. And in fact, President Macron of France went on in the European neutralist vein to say, we shouldn't bias relations with China. It's more than just a military competition, implicitly alluding to European desire to get their hands on the Chinese market rather than worry about them geopolitically overmuch. He went on to say the North Atlantic Treaty Area has very little to do geographically with China and really shouldn't have a major role in this. So the NATO meeting, despite some nice talk about cybersecurity, meant even less than the ineffectual G7 summit. And then finally, the meeting with Putin. Well, they didn't throw chairs at each other. I mean, this is good. They managed to sit together. Biden somehow talked back, calling Putin a killer, and they agreed to work together on cybersecurity, which is a bit rich, as Russia is the problem here. As for the conclusion, what do we learn from the Biden doctrine? How did it stand up to the real world that it actually encountered? Pretty badly. And here are four takeaways that I can give you just in conclusion. One, beyond the press cheerleading of the three summits that they're good vibrations now that the evil Donald Trump is gone and we can all get back to normal with the sane, decent man at the head, which is certainly the vibe the press is giving out. The actual policy reality of the summit's very thin gruel indeed. A little bit of housekeeping here, a little bit of symbolism there, but frankly, even the communiques are watered down to the point that they don't matter. People confuse conferences with action. World politics is decided by interests primarily, not by photo ops and not even by personalities. And we forget that. And the interests of the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese don't change because Joe Biden is a more likable guy and we'd rather have a beer with him than Donald Trump. So that's important to keep in mind. Can we really, because of good vibrations, accept the Germans to spend more money on defense? I think we all know the answer to that is no. So it's important to look at what actually happened and not just the vibrations, which are now being overstated by a center-left press to help a center-left president. Second, although Europe certainly and the EU shares American values, and this is important, this is why the United States and Europe tilt more toward each other than away from each other, the U.S. and Europe do not share common interests on the most important issue of the day, which is China. Europe alternates between a pro-American and neutralist position on the continuum, unlike the Anglosphere, India, and Japan, which are much more in the pro-American camp and the anti-Chinese camp. Part of the reason for this is geography. I'm a geopolitician, and all these other places, other than the UK, are much closer to China than is Europe, so they have a different view of what's going on. But the reality is that there is an anti-Chinese, pro-Western coalition forming, with Europe as the outlier, and that's what we can see. So not only was China not prioritized fully, Europe indeed can't be placated fully. And then the third point, can Russia really be parked for 4 years? Frankly, that doesn't depend on summit optics and who throws a chair at who and does Biden apologize for calling Putin a killer. It depends on Putin's national interests and what he wants to do. Russia indeed shouldn't be the American strategic priority. It should be the second priority. The priority is managing China. That is the game. All the risk and all the reward are in the Indo-Pacific. And that's why my firm studies it intensively, why that's the main thing we think about, all the future risk and all the future reward. But Russia will not just sit on the sidelines because America's nice to it or polite to it at a meeting. So that would be a naive hope. Lastly, the great powers have their own trajectories. Unlike in the Cold War, and here's where the Biden doctrine falls really flat. In the Cold War, if you read a Graham Greene novel, of which I am incredibly fond, most relationships tragically can be tied back to the American-Soviet ties. Now that's not true. The great powers have a lot more room for maneuver. So Japan can say it can be pro-American or neutralist, India pro-American or neutralist, the Anglosphere pro-American or neutralist, the EU pro-American or neutralist, and Russia pro-China or neutralist. But they have a lot more say in how they behave and how they maneuver. That has nothing to do with Donald Trump. That has everything to do with the structure of the world. So the Biden doctrine, the idea that somehow all democracies, because they share values, magically share interests, has been proven wanting at these meetings. He hasn't followed Einstein's dictate, which is, yes, it's good to simplify, but don't ever make things too simple. This makes a very complicated world too simple. Thanks.